According to Aristotle, there are certain kinds of people who are not fit to study ethics. That is to say, there are certain people who shouldn't be in the ethics classroom. Ethics classes aren't for them. And you might think that sounds a little bit odd. I mean, who couldn't benefit from studying a little bit of ethics, all right, or whatever. It gets even more odd, however, when you see who it is that he thinks shouldn't study ethics, who is not a proper student of ethics, because it's kind of the opposite of what you would think. What you might think is that people who are super good already, people who are very moral and upstanding and ethical in their own right, they don't really need to study it because they already know what's going on. Whereas people who aren't like that, who aren't there yet, those are the people who need to take classes in ethics. Aristotle thinks the exact opposite of that, really. The only people who should be studying ethics are the good people, really. So let's see more. And so that's kind of paradoxical. Why would he say something like that? Why would he think that? Let's see what he has to say, how he limits his audience, who he thinks the proper student of ethics is. So according to Aristotle, ethics is, he makes two limitations, right? So the first one is he says, no young people. Ethics is only for older people. And you can find this in book 1, chapter 3. Now that might strike you as a little bit odd. Don't we want to teach young people how they ought to behave, what it's right and wrong to do, what's good and bad and evil and so on, right? It seems like young people should be the ones that we're really reaching out to. But here at the outset of the ethics, Aristotle wants to say, no, ethics is only for older people. Well, why? He gives two reasons. First, young people, he claims, they follow their passions, not reason. And he says this is true not just of young people, but people with young characters, youthful characters. So you might find old people running around like this too, who just follow their passions, their desires, something like that, wherever they go. That's what they do. And he says this, don't take this so much as like an indictment of young people. Like young people are terrible. Although, I don't know, there might be some of that in there. Really what he's saying, though, is that this is just a fact about young people. It's how human beings develop and grow at a certain stage in life. I think he's thinking probably like your teenage years here, right? These are going to be the young people he has in mind. Human beings during that time frame, they don't really submit their actions and motivations and what they're going to do, their plans, to reason. They just follow their desires, their pleasures, their passions, as Aristotle calls them. And so his idea here is not that, well, and that's terrible, so you shouldn't study ethics. That's not the idea. His idea here is ethics would be unprofitable for them. Ethics is only going to be of use to somebody. Like thinking about what a good life is, thinking about the good, thinking about how we ought to live is only going to be profitable and it's only going to be of any use if you, the hearer of ethics, the person studying it, the student of it, if you will submit your own life to the findings of ethics. If you can follow what reason dictates, what you find upon rational reflection about ethics, right? If you can follow that, young people won't follow it. And so his idea here is not so much that, make sure they don't get in the ethics classroom because there's all this secret knowledge that we can't share with them because they just follow their passion. That's not his idea. His idea is that it'd be a waste of time. Fine, have them in the room. They're just wasting their time because it's not going to make any difference for them. That's because they just follow their passions. They're not going to submit themselves to reason. Older people, not all of them, but some of them at least, right, will be able to submit their lives to reason. They don't just follow passion wherever it happens to go. And so ethics could be profitable for them because in studying these things, they might then be able to incorporate them into their lives and follow reason and not just their passions. So that's the first thing. Second thing he says is that young people are inexperienced in the actions of life. They're inexperienced. And look, ethics is about life and about the actions of life, about how one ought to live. And in order to really understand what's at stake in ethics, in order to really understand what is being claimed about how we ought to live, about how we ought to conduct ourselves, you need to have a little bit of life experience, Aristotle is saying. And look, younger people, just in virtue of being younger, don't have that. And so the idea is they're not really going to be able to understand what we're talking about. They just need more experience. They need to go out and live a little bit, live a life, engage in the actions of life a bit on their own, and then they'll have the requisite experience, perhaps, to profitably engage in ethics, to understand what's going on. So that's the second reason he gives for why only older people should be studying ethics. Now, I think the second limitation he gives, so ethics is only for older people. That's the first limitation of who ethics is for, right? The second one he gives, I think, is more important and more interesting, and we're going to return to it later, in fact. But what he says in Book 1, Chapter 4, is that ethics is only for people who have been raised in good habits. And this might seem even more paradoxical. You might think that ethics is really going to be for bad people, people who've been raised in bad habits, because they're the people who need a little bit of help. They need to, we need to instruct them concerning what's right and wrong, what's bad and good, right? People who've been raised in bad habits, they're going to have false ideas, bad ideas about what morality requires, about how they should behave or act. And what we need to do is change those ideas that they have, right? And so you might think that ethics should be particularly for bad people, something like that, or immoral people or something like that. And what Aristotle is saying, no, immoral people, people who haven't been raised in good habits, they should not study ethics. Well, why? What exactly is he getting at here? Here's his reason. This is what Aristotle says in Book 1, Chapter 4. Only people who have been raised in good habits, Aristotle says, can grasp the facts. And the facts are the starting point of ethics. Easy as that, right? That's why. Now, one question I hope you would have, right, that anybody who reads this chapter should have is, what on earth does he mean by the facts? Now, that's how our translation has it. If you look at the Greek, Aristotle says there is no Greek word for facts. That's not really what Aristotle says. What Aristotle says, in the Greek at least, is the that. Only people who've been raised in good habits can grasp the that. The that is the starting point of ethics. That's even more puzzling. That doesn't even make grammatical sense, let alone just normal old sense, right? That what on earth is he talking about? And that's all Aristotle says. He doesn't really say anything else. And that's why people who have been raised in bad habits shouldn't study ethics. They can't grasp the that. All right, so what on earth is he talking about? What does he mean in saying it's the starting point of ethics? What is going on here? What he means by grasping the that, though he doesn't clarify this in Book 1, Chapter 4. You have to go to other places where Aristotle talks about the that to figure out that this is what he's talking about. What he means by grasping the that is being able to make correct, particular moral judgments. So, for example, being able to correctly judge that what she did is generous. What she just did over there, that was the generous thing to do. Being able to correctly judge that right now, if I'm going to, what courage requires of me is to stand up to them right now. They're making a fuss about blah, 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 or whatever, right? And, what it would be appropriate for me to do, what the courageous thing to do right now would be for me to stand up and say no or whatever, right? Something like that. Correct, particular moral judgment about what virtue requires or about what morality requires in some particular situation. final example, right? Something like that guy over there. And this, look what he's doing. That's unjust, right? He's being unjust to all those people. Being able to make correct, particular moral or ethical judgments. Moral or ethical judgments, those are judgments about generosity and courage and justice and what's right and wrong, what kind of behavior is appropriate and inappropriate. Particular, such judgments would be things about like that particular person in this particular situation doing that particular thing, right? So no, he's not talking, when he's talking about grasping to that, he's not talking about grasping general philosophical principles. That's not what he's talking about. General theories about what morality requires or anything like that. Just this kind of intuitive, reflexive, just that's the appropriate thing to do. What she just did, yeah, that's what you want to do, right? That ability. Not necessarily being able to explain why, but just being able to judge correctly that, yeah, that was appropriate. And being able to do all this correctly, right? So people might make incorrect moral judgments. So, you might see someone walking down, walking across campus, and a $20 bill falls out of their pocket, and the person walking behind them just picks it up and puts it into their pocket. You might judge, well, you would never judge this, but let's say you judge, man, that was awesome. Good on that guy who picked up that $20 bill. He's $20 richer. Finders keepers. Awesome. I wish I were that guy. That was awesome. That's incorrect, right? That would be an incorrect particular moral judgment. You'd be judging that what that guy just did right there in that situation, you'd be judging that that was awesome or whatever, right? You'd be judging that it was, I don't know what you'd be judging, right? You wouldn't be judging that it was immoral, that it was greedy, that it was unjust. Whereas the correct judgment of that situation would be those things, right? It'd be that was unjust. That's not fair. That's not right. He ought to give that money back, right? Those would be the correct judgments. And so grasping that is having a kind of general ability where you're able to make correct particular moral judgments. And how do you get that ability? Well, Aristotle says, by being raised in good habits. We're going to talk more about the relationship between grasping that, and good habits later when we get to book 2, because in book 2, Aristotle talks all about habits. But for now, so that's what he means by grasping that. You come to be able to make correct particular moral judgments by being raised in good habits. And that's essential for ethics. You need to be able to make correct particular moral judgments. Why? Because these correct particular moral judgments are the starting points of ethics. His idea here is that these correct judgments are something like the very basic data of ethics. And if someone doesn't grasp the kind of basic data of a field, they can't study the field in question. They can't come to have knowledge of that field, right? If someone wants to study, I don't know, oak trees, and they don't know, and okay, fine, great. Well, if you're going to study oak trees, you need to, at the very least, grasp some very basic data about them, right? Now, let's say this person who wants to study oak trees, they've never seen one. They have no information about, how big they are, what color they are, whether they have leaves, whether it's even, what they do throughout the seasons, how they reproduce in terms of, I don't know, acorns or so, I don't know. Let's say somebody has no idea about any of that and they want to go study oak trees. And let's say, moreover, that they have no intention of learning any of that stuff. They're not going to go out and observe any oak trees. They're not going to listen to anybody tell them all this stuff about oak trees. They're not going to go read any books about it, right, that has this basic information, basic data, right? A very what's the word? A very plausible thing to say about this is you shouldn't study oak trees, right? You've got to go get this basic data first before you can possibly understand, right? oak trees in the way that a biologist does or a botanist does, right? If you don't have that basic data and you're not willing to listen to someone who does have it, you can't possibly study this thing. You can't possibly come to have any knowledge of it. Aristotle is saying the same thing about ethics. These correct particular moral judgments are the basic data of ethics. And if you have someone who can't grasp them and who's not going to listen to somebody else who's grasped them, who's not going to listen, right? Let's say it's, you have that guy who's judging, yeah, that was awesome when you picked up the $20. But then somebody else comes along and says, no, it wasn't. That was unjust. And the guy who says, no, that was awesome, doesn't listen to nah, you're wrong. It's not unjust. That was awesome. A guy like that shouldn't study ethics. He doesn't grasp the very basic data of ethics. He's like the guy who wants to study, he's like the guy who doesn't grasp anything about oak trees. Such a guy should not study oak trees. Yeah, it'd be in vain. It'd be fruitless. That's Aristotle's idea again, right? For such a person who doesn't grasp that to study ethics, it's not as though there's some secret knowledge that we can't let these people have. It'd be pointless. It'd be worthless. It'd be in vain. They're not going to get anything out of it. And so he limits who should study ethics to people who will actually get something out of it. Young people and people who have been raised in poor habits won't get anything out of it, and so they shouldn't study ethics. That's his idea.